Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into Liat Portal's foundational framework to figure out exactly how and why human judgment is quietly relocating in the age of AI. We are looking at a concept that fundamentally changes how we view our everyday interactions with automated systems.
So, who is actually making the judgment? To really get this, picture a scenario drawn right from the source material. Imagine a high-stakes software outage at a massive tech company. Revenue's tanking, executives are breathing down everyone's necks, and an AI triage system ranks the incident and recommends a specific fix. Now, the human engineering team looks at the data, and they actually disagree with the AI. They're looking at indicators pointing to a completely different root cause. And yet, they hesitate to just act on their own independent expertise. Why is that?
Well, it's because of what happens next. Someone in that room literally says, "We need a reason to override the system." That single sentence brilliantly captures a non-formal state transition. Think about it. The human engineers are still formally responsible. It's their jobs on the line, but the AI has somehow become the practical reference point. Disagreeing with the system now requires greater justification than just following their own hard-earned expertise. The default position of legitimacy has completely shifted.
Okay, we've got a lot of ground to cover. We're going to break this down into 5 parts. 1, defining the concept. 2, the 5 conditions. 3, the core variable. 4, mapping the mechanism. And 5, boundary locks. Let's jump right in. Section 1. Defining the concept. Unpacking authority drift. To recognize this totally invisible transition, we have to look closely at the precise definition established in the foundational article. Authority drift is the gradual shift in perceived legitimacy from human agents to automated systems, specifically through repeated cognitive delegation. The crucial thing to remember here: this isn't some sci-fi scenario where AI forcibly seizes control. No, we are the ones giving the system more thinking work, asking it to analyze, to summarize, to recommend. And over time, that repeated cognitive delegation quietly builds the system's credibility until it functions as a practical authority.
Now, it's incredibly important to clarify that not every single use of an automated system creates this drift. A simple, efficient workflow, like, say, using a calculator to crunch numbers or an app to organize a spreadsheet, that just accelerates tasks. Your professional judgment stays completely intact. But authority drift? That happens when the system's output becomes your unquestioned starting point for complex judgment. It means you're actively outsourcing your cognitive friction.
All right, moving on to Section 2. The 5 conditions, the anatomy of drift.
Drift is not just a loose metaphor. It has a very specific structural anatomy. For authority drift to actually be happening, it has to meet these 5 conditions. First, direction. It has to be moving away from human judgment and toward the system. Second, force. That repeated cognitive delegation we just talked about. Third, gradual accumulation. It's a slow buildup, not an overnight takeover. Fourth, it alters a continuous variable, meaning it's a sliding scale, not an on-off switch. And fifth, it's a non-formal state transition, meaning practical authority is shifting right beneath official on-paper policies. Which brings us to Section 3, the core variable, isolating legitimacy.
What is truly fascinating here is how the framework isolates exactly what is shifting away from us. Perceived legitimacy is the central core variable. It represents the actual standing to shape judgment. The source material makes it crystal clear. This is entirely different from just trusting an output, relying on a tool, or giving an algorithm a bit more decision weight for a specific task. It's also completely independent of accuracy, which, changes from answer to answer. And it's totally separate from formal decision rights, which are just those official on-paper permissions.
This leads to a massive realization. Humans can remain in the loop on paper, but if they just default to accepting the system's judgment, practical authority has already drifted. Think about that for a second. Formal human oversight alone absolutely does not stop authority drift. You can have an ironclad policy saying a human has the final say, but if that human just rubber stamps the AI because it's easier, the drift has already happened.
Let's look at Section 4, mapping the mechanism, the directional shift.
To map exactly how this happens over time, Liat Portal introduces a conceptual representation of this directional mechanism. Now, a quick disclaimer. We have to read this not as some strict mathematical law, an empirical proof, or a diagnostic score. Instead, look at it as a symbolic, behavioral map, showing how this shift progresses conceptually.
Let's slow down and trace this path. As our repeated reliance goes up through cognitive delegation, the friction of independent thinking goes down. Why? Because fast answers completely bypass our need to stop and reflect.
Because of this, the system becomes our default starting point. Consequently, the system's perceived legitimacy shoots up. And finally, human practical authority quietly decreases. It's basically a domino effect of human behavioral adaptation.
And finally, Section 5, Boundary Locks, Separating Drift from Outcomes.
We need to explicitly lock down some boundaries to separate authority drift from concepts that sound kind of similar, but operate very differently. This is critical. Authority drift is the gradual movement itself. It is not authority projection, which is just a single moment or interaction where an AI sounds super confident. It's not standard automation bias or basic reliance because it fundamentally alters legitimacy. It is not algorithmic authority, which is the resulting state or destination, and it's certainly not AI disempowerment, which is a possible negative outcome or harm to the user. To put it simply, drift is the journey, not the destination.
It's also distinctly different from an institutional failure of human oversight. An oversight failure is an institutional condition. It's when formal rules are actively broken or ignored. Authority drift, on the other hand, happens quietly through our subtle behaviors. It happens even when the formal organizational rules are supposedly working perfectly, and the human is technically still checking all the right boxes.
Ultimately, the foundational article successfully nails down the exact mechanics, variables, and boundaries of how human judgment quietly slips away. It isolates the directional movement, it crowns perceived legitimacy as the core variable, and it proves that this is a behavioral, non-formal shift driven by our repeated cognitive delegation.
But, it is just as important to note what the article does not claim. The framework deliberately leaves the broader societal consequences outside of its immediate structural claims. It maps the mechanism perfectly, but it leaves out what ultimately happens to human development, human learning, and meaning-making when we start using AI to interpret our relationships, our emotions, and our very identities.
So I'm going to leave you with this really provocative thought straight from the source material. As we eagerly outsource our cognitive friction for the sake of speed and ease, are we actually prepared for a world where our very reality, our judgment, and our meaning-making are shaped by systems that have never actually experienced human life? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning where your judgment truly resides.